Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 38, Episode 1. Alvarado's Leap. This episode was written by Stephen Schuler. Stephen is a retired academic librarian after 21 years as associate professor in the University System of Georgia. He has published a dozen library and history-related articles, entries, and reviews. He obtained a master's in history at the University of Nebraska. His area of study, Latin America, with emphasis in 20th century Latin American revolutions. He is especially enthralled with the 16th century Castilian conquistadors and their amazing adventures in the New World. He now resides in St. Paul, Minnesota, with his lovely wife, Shirley. He does plenty of golfing and reading when not travelling. Modern historical scholarship has little lenience for hyperbole, and any event that appears exaggerated is heavily scrutinized. The Spanish Conquest of Mexico provides ample folklores for historians to examine. One tale depicts renowned conquistador Pedro de Alvarado vaulting across a canal to escape certain doom, an episode since identified as the Salto de Alvarado, Alvarado's Leap. Historians are now in broad agreement that Alvarado's Leap is but a legend. Alvarado's alleged narrow escape occurred during the Castilians' withdrawal, known as the Noche Triste, Night of Sorrows, a crucial, indeed pivotal event in the conquest of Mexico. However, what happened to the rear guard on that rainy dark night on Calzada de Tlacopan, Tacuba Causeway, remains a mystery. Pedro de Alvarado's Leap has long been famous in song and story, and tour guides happily point out the spot. The alleged spot still bears the name Salto de Alvarado, at the intersection of the streets now named Jose Terran and Puente de Alvarado. The story goes that after waging a desperate rearguard action, the unhorsed conquistador narrowly escapes over a breach in the causeway by thrusting his lance into the debris below and vaulting over the channel. A feat that even Bob Seagren or Indiana Jones would be envious of. After 500 years, Alvarado's Leap remains firmly embedded in the folklore. However, the row stirred up concerning its authenticity has existed since its origin. Nearly all modern historians dismiss it as fiction. Many don't bother to argue that the jump would have been impossible for the breadth and depth of the trench. They prefer to dismiss it as a fabrication created by 16th century chroniclers to exalt and exploit and sell a story with dramatic tension. Furthermore, since 1810, Mexico's patriots have denounced and dismissed any deeds of Hernan Cortes and the Spanish conquerors. It is still fashionable for Mexican historians to dismiss the conquistadors as a band of invaders who committed atrocities and destroyed a noble civilization, and ascribe nothing heroic to them. Pedro de Alvarado was a skilled swordsman and an expert horseman. His flamboyant and provocative style made him a natural-born leader. Often impetuous and allegedly cruel, he was second in command to Hernan Cortes throughout the conquest of Mexico, and later led the conquest of Guatemala. He was born in 1485 in the town of Badajoz, Extremadura, Castile. His hair and beard were of a striking reddish-brown, distinguishing him from his companions in the eyes of the Indians and bringing him the nickname Tonatiuh, meaning the sun. He was popular with his men, and Cortes trusted him enough to leave him in command in the Mexican capital of Tenochtitlan when Cortes was forced to put down Panfilo Narvaez's attempt to intervene and foil his plans. With Cortes gone, the impulsive Alvarado acted rashly to rumors that the Mexican Emperor Montezuma and his lords were plotting an uprising. He suddenly ordered an attack and descended on a gathering of the Mexican nobility and slaughtered hundreds of them. Alvarado's reckless preemptive strikes caused the entire city to rise in outrage, and the conquistadors became besieged in the capital. After Cortes's triumphant return from the coast, a plan was drawn up to evacuate at night. During the retreat, Alvarado was placed in charge of the rear guard. The causeway over the lake from the island city was the only way out. The Mexico could easily disrupt the escape route by reducing portions of it. Although the conquistadors put together an improvised portable bridge to get across the gaps, the ferocious attacks on the retreating column rendered it useless. The valiant and daring Pedro de Alvarado was the last across the final gap, and a legend was born. Pedro de Alvarado survived the Noche Triste, but his subsequent feats of conquest did not give him absolute power, although he was one of the few conquistadors able to maintain his preeminence in a time when the Emperor Charles V followed a policy of removing them from positions of power. He was called to face the Audiencia of Mexico in 1529. The Audiencia was an inspector general and magistrate council or high court with executive functions. The members of the Audiencia persistently proceeded to uproot the friends of Cortes for their own power grab. In 1529, with Nuño de Guzman presiding, the Audiencia outdid themselves in their determination to ruin Alvarado. 34 charges were formulated, ranging from illegally hoarding riches and oppressing natives to fraudulently wearing a robe of the Order of Santiago. Accusation number 6 basically accused him of cowardice and abandoning the rearguard during the Noche Triste, and the further accusation is made against Pedro de Alvarado that, being captain of foresaid and commanding the rearguard with many horses and foot soldiers at the time when the army evacuated the capital, the said Pedro de Alvarado arrived at one of the gaps which existed in the causeway, there being one beam remaining across the gap on which the Spaniards must pass. The said Pedro de Alvarado vaulted the gap, leaving his people without a captain, while the enemy came behind them. The more serious charges which the commissioners counted on to win them favour in Spain were concerning Alvarado's withholding the royal fief of gold and jewels that the conquistadors were obliged to give their monarch. Alvarado answered all the accusations point by point, in detail, and in writing, in addition to presenting witnesses on his behalf. In the one and only time Alvarado himself addressed the legendary leap, he stated simply, "It was a dark night when the rearguard left the city. Those that came with me had perished or gone ahead. I was alone and badly wounded, and my horse dead. I was seeing that I had to get going to cross the said trench." The commissioners' serious charges were all abandoned without a conviction against Alvarado. However, this thorough examination of his actions was the first written evidence of any kind of leap or vault attempted by Alvarado on July 1st, 1520. The vaulted the gap phrase in the accusation is unmistakable. but vague. Also, the one beam remaining across the gap is significant. Historians critical of Alvarado's pole-vaulting prowess have viewed the beam as Alvarado's true escape route. Alvarado himself, though, was not forthcoming, and his ambiguous response did not throw light on the controversy of the leap. It is understandable that the manner of his escape was inconsequential and skimmed over considering the remainder of the Audiencia's rather ominous charges. Francisco Lopez de Gomara really initiated the whole controversy of Alvarado jumping over a ditch back in 1552 with the publication of the Chronicles of New Spain. He was the first to devote a separate book to the conquest of Mexico, and it made an incredible splash, despite being promptly suppressed by Prince Philip, later Philip II, then governing overseas affairs for his father Emperor Charles V. Unlike Gomara's usual bedazzling praise of the conquistadors that piqued the royal government, his descriptions of the event is rather pedestrian and uninspired. He reached the last channel and vaulted over it with his lance, a feat that amazed the Indians and even the Spaniards, for it was a prodigious leap. Gomara does not reveal much about his sources in his work. He acted as Cortes's chaplain and personal secretary from 1541 until Cortes died in 1546. It is widely believed that most of his narrative was gathered from his employer. Cortes may have witnessed the prodigious leap, or Alvarado related it to his commander, or perhaps someone else witnessed it and reported it to Cortes. Regardless, it is unlikely Gomara invented or imagined it, and Cortes likely chose to have him include it. Modern historian Hugh Thomas, a stern critic of Gomara's late Italian Renaissance writing style, agrees that author, Gomara, usually wrote what his patron told him. Thomas 117. Yet Thomas flatly says, this leap of Alvarado's never occurred. Thomas 411. Cortes's biographer, Gomara, did admire the conquistadors, and let his pen get away with him at times. He often described events extravagantly in the tradition of the romantic novels of the time. Wherever Gomara had heard about Alvarado's leap, he wrote it down, and unbeknownst to him, his short description of Alvarado vaulting a channel would lead to a Mexican legend still alive 500 years later. Widely considered the most authoritative accounts of the conquest, works few historians have any qualms with, are written by an eyewitness of the conquest. Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote his true history of the conquest of New Spain nearly 50 years after the conquest that he had participated in. Diaz, like Thomas, is contemptuous of Gomara's account, and his disgust shown towards the non-participant is often phenomenal in its intensity. However, it is evident that Diaz used Gomara's account as a guide to refresh his memory, and told his version without all the praise Gomara heaped on Cortes. Interspersed within his narrative, he contests very specific assertions by Gomara. For instance, Gomara conjectures that if the evacuation of Tenochtitlan was undertaken during the day, it may not have led to the disastrous Noche Triste. Lopez de Gomara 220. Diaz rebuts, saying, had it been in the daytime, it would have been far worse. As for Alvarado's leap, the garrulous old conquistador has much to say. It was also at this bridge of sorrows that the well-known leap of Alvarado was said to have taken place. At that time, indeed, none of us took notice whether he leaped well or not, for everyone had enough to do to escape from the hands of the merciless enemy. I am, however, inclined to believe that this leap was nothing more than what Alvarado told Cortes himself, how he had made his bridge over the canal by clambering over the baggage, dead bodies, and drowned horses, for the water was too deep in that place for him to have swung across the opening by means of his lance, and the width of the canal too great, however nimble Alvarado may have been, for him to have leapt across. It would have been impossible, I am sure, to have crossed it by means of his lance, or by leaping. Diaz also described seeing Alvarado badly wounded, with a spear in his hand and on foot, for the enemy had already killed his sorrel mare. He remembers a spear in Alvarado's hand, conceivably the spear Alvarado vaulted with, regardless a detail that lends authenticity to a leap. Also Diaz must have been present when he recounts Alvarado's report to Cortes on the rearguard action. Alvarado related that after he and his men had all lost their horses he managed to get together about 80 men, and with these he succeeded in passing over the first opening by clambering over the baggage, dead men and horses, although I am not sure whether he said that he passed the opening by stepping over the dead bodies. I know that at this bridge more than 200 men, with Leon at their head, were cut to pieces by the enemy. Notwithstanding all their courageous fighting, at the second bridge again it was merely through God's mercy that Alvarado had saved himself, as all the canals and streets were crowded by the enemy. The aged conquistador even recalls the next year when he returns to the site of the alleged jump and deliberates about its possibility with others. I myself can speak from eye-witness, for the following year when we marched against Mexico and surrounded the town on all sides, I often came in contact with the enemy at that bridge, which now bears the name of Alvarado's Leap. At that time the Mexicans had blocked up the passage with palisade and breastwork, and I very frequently spoke with my fellow soldiers about the circumstance, but none of them ever thought such a leap possible. As the years passed he became increasingly sceptical. Obviously any aggrandizement of Alvarado's acrobatics tormented Diaz, and he was not content with his previous argument. Wagner 200. In the revision of his work he added yet another swipe at Gomara and affixed more doubt about Alvarado's feat. And all that Gomara said in this case is a hoax, saying he leapt relying on a lance because the water was very deep, and there was no reaching the bottom with it, and besides the bridge and the opening were wide and high and not possible to jump across, using neither a lance nor any other manner. Diaz throughout his works expresses a certain admiration and respect for Alvarado. The veteran conquistador sailed with Alvarado on the preceding Juan de Grijalva expedition to Mexico, and was under his direct command during the conquest. Consequently, he often defends Cortes's reckless lieutenant. He certainly does not see Alvarado as a coward, or that he faltered in his duties. He gives us one more passage about how the leap quickly gained notoriety. Among Garay's troops there was a certain Ocampo, who came to Mexico. This man possessed much wit, and was always writing pasquils, or libelling someone or other. Among other things he wrote a good deal of scandal and falsehood about our officers, and accused Alvarado that he had left Leon with upwards of 200 men and the whole of our cavalry, which composed the rear guard, in the lurch, and that in order to save his own life he had taken Alvarado's leap indeed, in accordance with the old proverb, leap and save your life. Diaz del Castillo 357. Diaz throughout his works does not overly extol the virtues or exploits of Alvarado, but he certainly is sceptical of his vault to safety that night. He did prevaricate on the matter, and this is consistent throughout his accounts with anything he did not directly participate in or witness. Neither Gomara's disciplined classicism nor Diaz's first-hand narrative give enough dramatic attention to make Alvarado's leap truly legendary. Andreas de Solis, the most renowned 17th century historian writing on the conquest, did dwell on the purported leap and describes it rather dramatically. For having found himself closely beset on every side, his horse killed from under him, and one of the canals still before him, on his way he fixed his lance or spear in the bottom of the lake, and forcibly raising his body by a notable spring of his feet supporting his weight in the air by strength of his arms, with a desperate leap, cast himself to the other side. Solis 237. Like Diaz, Solis waxes ambiguous whether the vaulting happened or not, but is also determinedly leery about it. His long, wordy paragraph devoted to Alvarado's alleged exploit is summed up with, "It might possibly be true, though somewhat improbable," and adds that due to the perilous situation Alvarado found himself in, it's not that unlikely he attempted a do-or-die leap to safety. The 16th century chroniclers Francisco González Ovidio and Francisco Cervantes Salazar and most others were fundamentally sympathetic to the project of Spanish expansion and conquistadors. They also say much the same thing about the alleged incident, and Solis probably drew upon their accounts. William Hickling Prescott is singularly most responsible for the legend of Alvarado's leap to reach its zenith. His all-encompassing epic narrative, published in 1843, reached an enormous audience. The exploits of the conquistadors gained widespread familiarity and inspired an upsurge of research and writing about the Golden Age of Spain. Prescott's primary source, or the pillars upon which the story of the conquest mainly rests, were Gomara and Diaz. His account of the disputed vault did not hedge a bit. Alvarado stood on the brink for a moment, hesitating what to do, unhorsed as he was, to throw himself into the water in the face of hostile canoes that now swarmed around the opening, afforded but a desperate chance of safety. He had but a second for a thought. He was a man of powerful frame, and despair gave him unnatural energy. Setting his long lance firmly on the wreck which strewed the bottom of the lake, he sprung forward with all his might and cleared the wide gap at a leap. Aztecs and Tlascalans gazed in stupid amazement, exclaiming as they beheld the incredible feat, "This is truly the Tonatiuh, the child of the sun." Prescott 477. Prescott discusses several aspects of the leap in his texts and his notes. He indicates that the spot of the leap is commemorated and familiar to all of Mexico City. Prescott was able to further spread the story to a much wider and discerning audience. Striving to verify Alvarado's action, he cites Alvarado's heirs and a Tlaxcalan account alongside his main sources. Skepticism did not escape the great Prescott, alluding to the very real physical misgivings. But since the length of the leap, strange to say, is nowhere given, the reader can have no means of passing his own judgment on its probability. Most authors prior to the 20th century included Alvarado's leap in their narrative, sometimes questioning it, but not discounting it. Efforts to explode the myth began in earnest with Adrian Resineau's 1952 biography of the controversial conquistador. Unlike John Kelly's 1932 apologetically written biography, Resineau's is more balanced and objective, but he spuriously dismisses anything regarding the legendary leap as a legitimate occurrence. Resineau's refers mainly to Solis's equivocal account of the leap, exclaiming that it is a genuine historical source which is rather specious. The legend of Alvarado's leap arises from the prevalent affection for the conquistadors at the time. Romantic chroniclers and authors like Diaz, Gomara, Duran, Oviedo, and Cortes himself were hypnotized by the romance novels of chivalry and adventures of the day, and aimed at eloquent and picturesque narration rather than the sterner but drier philosophy of critical history. Their writing formula does pose a problem even when extracting a consensus on the details. They lacked the indignation of another contemporary chronicler, Bartolomé de las Casas, the protector of the Indians. Las Casas is not at all credulous or romantic, but unfortunately he offers no version of the event, only a stinging criticism of the entire Cortes expedition. After the pacification of Tenochtitlan in 1521, Cortes commissioned Alvarado to expand the Spanish conquests and sent him on expeditions further south, which allowed him to also go down in history as the conqueror of Guatemala and El Salvador. By 1540, Alvarado was perhaps the most popular and powerful man in the Indies. His brilliant qualities as a field general were called upon again during the indigenous uprising against Spanish rule, known as the Mixton War. During the action at Nochistlan, while on a horse fording a stream and climbing up a steep bank, another horse came rolling down upon him, throwing and crushing him, and he died some days later, on July 4th, 1541. Pedro de Alvarado left behind no memoirs. He never really confirmed or denied his purported leap that summer night in 1520, after his chestnut mare fell dead and he was alone, dripping with blood, fending off his pursuers. Did he grab a lance and vault across a ditch? Consistent with most legends, confusion with the actual facts and events becomes the rule, and with each succeeding generation the legend becomes implanted, often with more embellishment. His fearless courage in the face of danger and against hopeless odds was sensational in itself. Nevertheless, chroniclers extol, dubious historians discount, and tour guides persist in recounting the tale of Alvarado's leap, despite its dubious likelihood. Well, thank you, Stephen, for writing that podcast for us. And if you'd like to write a script for us, or you have an idea for a subject that you'd like to have covered, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org. And do consider becoming a patron. You can do so at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Stephen Schuler, read by Nick Barker.